Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next episode of The Grow Show. I am delighted today to say that I'm welcomed by my good friend and former England coach, Mr. Mike Friday, the irrepressible spirit that he is. Mike, thanks ever so much for joining us today in the confines of your home with COVID-19 keeping us all wrapped up. Nice to have you here. Good to see you, mate.
Yeah, no, lovely to be on. Again, we're kind of in those kind of prison cells, aren't we? Like an open prison. You're allowed to do certain things. I've been ushered to the bedroom to stay out of the way because my two sons are in class, as they say. One in the front room, one in the back room. So the last thing I need is my dulcet tones disrupting them.
Oh, good luck keeping the homeschooling going. Right. So, I mean, such a fascinating career, Mike, from, playing as a England Sevens player, Wasps player, to then transferring over to coaching so many different nations around the world, working in the city. It is an illustrious CV. But I thought I would kick it off by just asking. Obviously, you had a fairly well established and pretty strong professional rugby playing career as a player for Wasps, Harlequins, and England Sevens, and what have you. And in 03, 04, when the time sort of came to hang up the boots, so to speak, you went straight into coaching. And I just wanted to look at, lots of people in business all the time experience that, like being an expert and then having to manage teams. Like, how difficult was that transition from being a player to then being a coach?
Yeah, I mean, I was probably quite fortunate as well because I was I'm that old, I was part of the mob that bridged amateur rugby and professional rugby. So I was actually always a chartered surveyor by trade. So when rugby went professional in 95, 96, I was just finishing my qualification to become a chartered surveyor. So rather than become a full-time pro, I made sure I finished that qualification. And, I was very fortunate to work for a company at the time called DTZ. And funny enough, throughout my professional playing career, when all the boys used to finish at the end of the day and go and play PlayStation or go down Nando's, as it was, I would get my suit on and go into work and continue to work and develop myself away from rugby, which at the time I kind of used to kick myself sometimes when the boys would be off having fun. But now when I look back, it was probably one of the smartest things I did do. So when the end did come, which was kind of 5 or 6 years later, it was on my terms because I didn't need to chase another contract. I could have gone abroad. I could have continued playing somewhere else, but I just felt I'd achieved all I could achieve in rugby. I mean, I would love to have achieved more, but the fact of the matter, I'd looked at the man in the mirror and I didn't really want to do anymore. So I made that decision to go back into the professional world of surveying, my own volition, which was a fantastic choice when I look back. And a great choice to be able to have. I often tell players now, let's make sure you're planning for tomorrow whilst you're enjoying today. And I actually had started my coaching 3 or 4 years earlier as well, believe it or not. So yeah. I was, again, a vocational coach. When I did my ACL, I needed something to keep me active alongside work and rehabbing, to keep the mind where it needed to be. And I started to explore coaching at the grassroots club I played as a young man or a young boy. Yeah. And started there and moved through. And, when I finished with Wasps and I was going back into the property world, it was a strange chain of events that I ended up being involved with England. And it was linked more with frustrations when I was there as a player, where I was like, you've either got to do something about yourself or you've got to shut up and move on. So it was an interesting time for me, that whole kind of 2001, 2002 season, which is when I started to get heavily involved with the England Sevens coaching, along with playing at Wasps and restarting my surveying career.
And how did you, just out of interest, skill sets as a player are very different to that of a coach. Like, how did you, I guess, identify those skill sets and manage that transferable, of transfer of skills or whatever, becoming a decent coach? The best players don't always make the best coaches.
Well, yeah, I mean, I certainly wasn't one of the best players. So I had to work very hard at the technical parts of the game. I was as a player, I was known as a bit of a maverick in terms of the running game and open decision making. But as a consequence, if your pass isn't that good, that's not great news if you want to be a Premiership 9. And my passing and kicking was the weakest part of my game. Yeah, I was a scrum half, but I could play. And, that probably will explain to you why I am so on top of everybody about their technical skills, because it was an area I had to work so hard at and didn't come naturally to me. And I think what's probably the most important thing about being a coach from a player is yes, there's the technical abilities, but it's also your communication skills and your ability to build relationships, have effective communication, the hard conversations as well as the supportive conversations. Now, for a Gobby 9, which is what I was, that was obviously playing to a strength, and the key thing is to be consciously aware of how you communicate and who you're communicating with, and that's something I paid a lot of attention to in the teams I played with, what I paid attention to where I worked, and I have a natural affinity to wanting to be a part of a team and get the best out of a team. So I think there's instincts involved in that. There's DNA in your character that you're built that way, and then of course you can nurture it, improve it, enhance it, and work at it. And they're areas that, whether I was in as a player, as I transferred across into coaching, and more importantly in the workplace, I took great pride in and wanted to be an effective team player, and understood what that meant.
I mean, in terms of a baptism of fire, I mean, you left professional playing and went straight into head coach of England, pretty much. At the time, England was a sleeping giant in terms of the sevens backdrop, and had so much potential, but hadn't really had anyone relish it and utilise it. How much of a daunting step was that, going into being head coach of England, and what was the kind of strategy or plan that you put in place?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Just like the story's a little bit like this, Ollie, to be fair, is that in 2001, 2002, my last year of Wasps, I was playing my last year of the contract with Wasps, and they had allowed me to go back into surveying. So I was on a flexi time with Wasps in order to do both. And that was the year that I had stepped away from playing for England Sevens, because I was like, I'm done with this, after an experience in 2001 at the World Cup where we were totally mismanaged with a very talented squad. But then there was an opportunity to get involved with England Sevens, and I threw my hat in the ring. But they gave it to Joe Lydon, if you remember, 2001 2.
That's where it began, and then you nurtured it from that on beyond there.
But what happened there was that Joe obviously was very new to rugby union, and my skill set was the technical part of the game. So what I'm saying is there was a gradual introduction to the coaching, alongside, because England had to go to DTZ and get them to say he's not coming back this year, he's coming back later. Okay. And DTZ agreed and supported me, which was amazing. But my responsibilities at the start were very tight, should I say? Not that I didn't have to worry about the autonomy of everything, because I still had so much to learn there. My area of expertise and focus was managing the players on the pitch to technically be better and tactically to be more proficient, which meant that I didn't have to get involved in the politics, the relationships at the higher level, be it at the boardroom level and at the director of rugby level. I could concentrate on building those relationships, developing and improving and making a more cohesive team on the rugby pitch, because that was how my relationship worked with Joe Lydon at that time. And again, it's understanding what I worked out very quickly is understood how you fitted into the picture and how you could contribute the best you can contribute, whilst ensuring that you give those around you the opportunity to do their job. So Joe could operate how he wanted. I delivered what he needed, but more importantly, the players had that platform and that consistency and support to allow them to try and get better and improve. And especially when you're managing the clubs, which Joe did at a stakeholder level, I would manage the players at that level so they felt at ease and they knew what was expected of them. So that's how that grew in those first couple of years. And then I was developing away from the rugby pitch my business skills in managing teams and being a part of a team in a different type of environment and business, which allowed me to develop that second part of the skill set, which is managing the stakeholders and understanding how the commercial part fits into the rugby part.
And then when you've finally took all the reins on your own in 04, between 04 and 06, what you just mentioned or touched on there, those skills or whatever that you developed to manage boards and external stakeholders, what were they? What was that transition? What were those learnings?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, it was, this is something that has rung true and stood the test of time with me, is that ability to move around the table. So to see things through your eyes, then see them through the eyes of the person that you're talking to, and then come above and see what that looks like. And it's harder to do. It's a harder thing to do than say, because in the heat of the moment or whatever, you get caught up in your eyes. And certainly as a younger man, I would be extremely fiery, passionate, and very much see it only my way. And I had to work very, very hard at trying to move around the table. And if I'm honest with you, in that 2004, 2006, there was times I got it massively wrong. But at the time, if it had told me, I'd be like, I didn't get it wrong. When I look back and I look at those things and those times and those experiences, I'm like, yeah, you could have done that differently without compromising the passion and the values that are important to you as a person.
Any specifics? I mean, you have to give the example, but like more broadly, like things you would do differently, of whether it be managing people or making decisions or whatever else.
Yeah, I think you've got to. I think sometimes as well, when you're driven by passion, you get caught up in trying to win every battle, rather than realise that it's a war, unfortunately, and you've got to realise that you don't need to win every point. You've got to understand what's important for the big picture. And then you've then got to kind of chunk down and work through those. You can't do it the other way around, where you just win that battle, because you're being tactical there. You're not being strategic. So there was times where I tried to win every little battle with players, for players, rather than get the player to understand a bigger picture and see how they fitted in. And I got better at that. But there were times where I probably only saw it through my eyes. I didn't see it through the director of rugby's eyes, and what the pressures he had and the strains that he was under. So I saw that in sport, and I also saw that in business. And business in sport is black and white. It's win or lose, right? In business, there's so many shades of grey that you have to realise that sometimes you lose when you win, and sometimes you win when you lose. Yeah. But that's hard for a sportsman to understand in business. So getting those battle scars in business enabled me to develop my decision making, my ability to move around the table a little bit more with less emotion. Got better and better, really, if I'm honest with you. So yeah, there are things I would definitely do. So I'm starting to reflect now. Like, a couple of things.
But I mean, in terms of like performance, England were third and second in the World Series in those 2 years, and that was probably at the root of nurturing and cultivating fabulous talent. I mean, obviously there was a certain Ollie Phillips that was nurtured and groomed at that point, but there were a lot of better players than me that came through in a bit of a golden era. You can list off the names of Danny Kerr, Matt Tate, Henry Paul. That's just a few like that just came through, and I remember playing with or seeing come through. Like, from your perspective, and people trying to put this into a business context as well, how did you nurture and identify that talent?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, obviously, they were identified talent. And the important thing to realise and recognise, and this is the point that I made to all of those types of players, there was two types of players in our programme. You have to understand that one needs the other. We had our 7 specialists who were the core. They were 7s. That was where they were world class. Yeah. Your Simon Amors, your Ben Gollins.
You're experts in the field.
They were experts, and I nurtured, and this was everything to them. So I invested a lot of time in making them the best versions of themselves within that field. You know, Simon especially. So he understood that he was my general in the middle. And then you have these other guys, you know, the Matthew Tates, the Danny Cares, the Ben Fodens, the Tom Barndells, the David Strettles, the Ollie Phillips, you know, the Luke Narroways. Yeah. But do you know what I mean? All of those, I mean, I think it was like 45 that came through that ended up playing for their country. But that was it. England Sevens was part of your development pathway. It wasn't everything, but we wanted to make sure that you had a positive experience, and everything that you learned here was transferable to take back to your club in your mission and your vision, which was to become an international 15s player. That was their ultimate aim. So
but how did you, I mean, that's a fairly big vision. Yeah, and you need a lot of stakeholders to buy in, from clubs, the union, in order to understand that Danny Care is going to come and play for England in the sevens here, and then he will play for his club Harlequins, and then ultimately he will be groomed into this world-class England player. How did you sell that vision? How did you make sure that people understood the aim?
Because what I chunked it up is the fact that if you work back to what Danny Care or Matthew Tate needed to be an international player, they needed exposure on an international stage without the ramifications of a Six Nations 15s match. Mm-hmm. But they needed to experience what it is. They need to understand that the magnification of errors and what the implications of that can be if you don't apply yourself a way to be the best version of yourself. The sevens is the perfect vehicle for that. So the standards and the expectations we set for them, and we were consistent, were clear, and were high. But more importantly, I had to also convince the clubs that it's in your best interest to commit to this for the year. Now that at times was an education process based on historic track record, a little bit of leap of faith, so a little bit of a sales pitch from myself as well. And then more importantly, a conscious effort to be effective in our communicating and consistent in when we communicated, so that the club didn't feel like they were in the dark. The player didn't feel like he was in the dark. Every decision was player-centered, which meant that there was no hiding from the hard conversations, and there was no protecting, from my perspective, the DOR. If I felt the DOR was not doing the best thing in the best interest of the player, he was looking at more important for his club. And as I've said to many DORs at the time, was if you are that reliant on a 21-year-old to win a premiership match that's not really in your first team 23, then that's not my issue. That's an issue you need to address within your club. Now, they're quite inflammable conversations, and they're conversations that were had at the start of the season, and a commitment as we work through the entire season. I think the reality of that is that was the start point, right? And if you ever have to go to a contract or an agreement, then that's a last resort, because you've got to build it on consistency of relationship and consistency of action and consistency of communication. And they were three things that I was very, very cognizant of needing to do with the directors of rugby and the players, because the players become your biggest advocates as well, because then you've got to allow them and help them to grow as young men, to be able to hold and have those conversations with their DOR in their own right. Yeah. And that's tough for a 19, 20-year-old to, because he just wants to please whoever is going to pick him. But then that's hard, right?
But it sounds like at the root of all of this, there's effectively trust from the player towards you, trust from the clubs towards you, trust from the union towards the vision statement, reciprocal, whatever. And it seemed like it paid off. You came third and second, and then it stopped. I mean, how did you build the trust? And then I don't know whether it did or didn't.
Why did it stop?
Yeah. I guess.
I think what people need to understand, that the vision was never about winning the World Series. The vision was winning development, not winning at the expense of development. And that was a two-way street. So I expected that from the clubs. And the year we finished second, right, when we were in the mix to win the series, what people don't realise is that 6 or 7 of those players going into that last two legs that had been with me the whole season weren't with me. Because at that time we had the main England tour and we had the Saxons tour and we had the two legs. Yeah. And we lost 5 or 6. to the Saxons. Now, that's a real success for me because at the start of the season, they weren't even in their first teams. They were on the fringe. So they'd come all the way through, and through their development and their experiences, they've gone. Now, selfishly, we would have wanted to keep them back and go for those last 2 legs. But we didn't, because that would be going against our very own philosophy, which was it's a pathway. It's your time to fly the nest. Even if
Did you see that at the time? Did you see that at the time? Did you see that?
I saw that at the time. Yeah.
You stayed engaged with the mission the whole way through.
For me, that was everything. I don't believe it or not. I mean, I love to win. Don't get me wrong. I love to win. But the thing that drives me as a coach and as a person when I was in business is I want you to be the best version of you. Yeah. What drives me is making you better. That's what I love. I see that smile on the face when something clicks or they get that reward. Or when I was in business and somebody nails that shopping centre deal and you've allowed them or given that opportunity to facilitate to do that. Because that is it's only a short shot of an injection of euphoria, but it's up there with winning. And that's what drove me. That's what happened when we finished third. The same thing again. So the reason it stopped is not because of that. The reason it stopped, being candid, is I lost trust in the union, and there was a change in leadership. Chris
and they didn't share in the vision.
Left. They didn't share in the vision, and they were compromising the players. And as a consequence, they were compromising my values. And then in my world, and the way I think, and I would do the same thing today as I did then, is you, in the nicest possible, you piss or get off the pot.
Yeah.
And I wasn't prepared to compromise my values and look people in, players in the eye and say, it's better that you stay back here and hold a pad and be 24th man when you could come and experience an international world-class tournament in Dubai and become a better rugby player.
Yeah.
And the DOR knew that. The RFU knew that. Yet they weren't prepared to have those conversations because they were trading off at the time for other access issues. So the political picture was getting in the way of the vision. And yet the vision was so important to the long-term continuity of the England side and the development of all these players. So, look, it got to the point where it's like you either conform and you become part of the corporate establishment, but if it undermines your values, it was only going to make me unhappy.
Yeah.
And as a consequence, then you have to take yourself out of that situation, and that's what I did. And I returned to the city. You talk about reflections on that. As a young man, I probably allowed some of my anger in that to spill out. Mm-hmm. And I learned a valuable lesson that sometimes it's better just to walk away, but the aggressive, passionate, angry scum half, little man syndrome, whatever you want to call it in me, meant I didn't leave on the terms that I should have left. I walked away, but I should have been better in the way that I walked away when I look back, and that's one of the regrets I had. But they're the battle scars that you learn along in life.
Teach you along the way. So I mean, you said you then went into DTZ in 06. Now, what were the transferables you took from you being a player? I mean, I know you'd worked in DTZ all the way through, but loosely you've been a player professionally. Then you've gone on and taken this England side and nurturing talent. What were the transferables you took to DTZ?
Well, again, that mental part of the journey for me, because my skill sets were in shopping centre investment. And, I'd been out of the shopping centre and the investment world for 3 or 4 years, right? So I was going back to do that because I thought, you can pick that up. It's still the same network, same people. I've just got to learn the marketplace again. Well, I walked through the door and as soon as I walked through the door, I got ushered into an office to sign an NDA. And then I got told, right, you're actually coming in to do shopping centre investment, Mike, but not really. We need you to build teams and we need you to run teams, and we're going to be buying Donaldson's, which was a huge another big surveying company, and you're going to be a big part of the merger and the integration of the people. And when you're like, I'm not sure I signed up for that. Yeah. But by the same token,
did you want to do that? Was it exciting, or were you like, oh god, I want to leave?
I was like, well, I was like, well, but be honest with you, I was like, well, I just want to, I need to, you know, I've given up rugby. I'm going to earn money, right? So,
Yeah, I'll do anything.
and shopping centre investment is more lucrative than integration and merging. But when I sat back and you know, they were very clear. They was like, you've got people skills, you can build relationships, you've got good flexibility and communication, you understand how to build teams, what's important in terms of the teams. And we need that in this integration where we're bringing differing cultures and we need to find common ground and a common way forward. And we've got to align people and we've got to motivate people. And we've got to have consistency in word and in action. So, you know, a lot of that from rugby is transferable into business. But again, in business where there's a lot of shades of grey, to be a strong man manager, you've got to be consistent in word and in action. And I think that is something that I've lived by and will continue to live by, which sometimes means could hurt you personally. It can compromise positions. But if you're true to doing the best things of the team, you know, leadership can be hard, right?
Yeah.
It can be unforgiving. It can be tiring, but it's hugely rewarding when you get that alignment. So,
how do you deliver that consistency? You mentioned it loads of times already. Like that, how do you make sure that is, you know, consistency is consistent?
Because I will try, and you know, because when you've got super high performers, right, whether that's in sport or whether that's in business, genuinely they're very, very selfish. So they tend to get it in their minds that they are being consistent, and they're not. But they're not. Their agenda is about them, and you want your high performers to be like that, but they need to be held to task on what is acceptable and what is not in terms of behaviours and values, and get them to understand and nurture and see the bigger team picture. That is hugely time consuming and energy sapping for a manager. You know, I could give you some cracking examples in rugby, and I could give you some cracking examples in business of these people. You need them to be successful in both sport and business, but by the same token, their actions and behaviours can't compromise what's important for the group.
Okay.
And sometimes I've seen it in sport and I've seen it in business where they are allowed to rule the roost and run the roost because we're either worried that we're not going to win or we're worried we're going to lose £2 million worth of income. And ultimately, you might lose that 2 million that he does, but you're compromising the 6-7 million that you would have got as a team. So, it's a delicate balance to give those individuals the freedom to be them, which is important, but ensure that they stay within the boundaries of the pitch, for want of a word, or the values and the behaviours that are acceptable for the group. And getting the high performers to understand that is one thing, but also getting the rest of the team to understand that this guy needs the freedom. He's not getting away with blue murder. He's got some freedom, but judge him on what he needs to be judged on. If he compromises values, you know, let's be very simplistic. If he's rude or obnoxious, whether that's in sport or business, then he's going to be held to task, because there's a right way and a wrong way to deal with people, and a right way and a wrong way to treat people in a team environment.
How did you manage those consistencies then when you're obviously at DTZ between 06 and then 2010, which was, you know, 08, 09, the massive credit crisis, credit crunch, the housing market, it fell through the floor. You know, how did you maintain those consistencies? How did you manage that stress? You know, all those sorts of things as a leader, as a manager.
It was hard. Life. I mean, again, because I would still probably say back then I was quite young. You know, I was in my late 30s, and you know, hit with dealing with, you know, we'd just gone through this merger, we'd just got this team aligned, and we were moving in the right direction. Then bang, and then all of a sudden we went through 5 or 6 rounds of redundancy. Where, however you say, it's not personal, it's done on a process, but when you're delivering that type of news, it's horrible, you know, and being able to manage the stress of being able to not disassociate, but not carry the transference of the guilt, the disappointment and the sadness of the conversations you had to have, but at the same time remain empathetic, honest, genuine, authentic with the people you're talking to, was really, really hard. And I made a really conscious effort of not to avoid the hard conversations. Yes, I had to remain within corporate messaging, but I would always ensure that the person that was sat opposite me, it was personable, and I would honestly answer the questions, even if they didn't necessarily want to hear the answers. And I think that that's the same in sport as well when it comes to, say, selection.
Yeah, I was going to say, did your experience of selection conversations help or hinder that conversation?
No, they hugely helped, and also I obviously drew on the conversations of when I was a player, and I had selection conversations, and you all know as a player, right? The ones that make sense and the ones that don't.
Yeah.
You've all been dropped, and it's like you're giving them, that's just a load of rubbish.
Yeah.
As opposed to the one where you're like, it rings true, and if you looked in the mirror, you're like, yeah, he's got a point there. And I looked at those types of personalities that I'd had those conversations with, and I drew on the conversations that I'd had with players when I'd left them out of things, and where I tried to be empathetic but honest, genuine, the reasons why, but more important as well, try and offer a solution. The challenging bit in this redundancy situation is you can't really offer a solution. You can offer things, on support, but not necessarily the solution, which is, well, you do this, you'll get your job. You couldn't do that. So that was, again, tested me and allowed me to develop my people skills, and again, improve my understanding and appreciation of how to be more flexible in your communication, more cognizant and more aware of reading people's body language and how they're feeling. Yeah. And I'd say one of the other things is, don't get uncomfortable with silence and people showing their emotions. You know how there are a lot of times, more so in business and sport, where if the person you're talking to, where it illustrates extreme emotions, you can become very uncomfortable and try and try and make the situation better, when the reality is that's not necessarily what that individual wants. So again, those types of
how do you remain so sort of objective or almost standoffish, if you like, in we're all emotional beings? Like, was it like a switch in your brain of like, oh my God, don't move?
Well, I would read that. I loved people watching anyway, and I would read the person, and sometimes they just want to be left, and other times it wouldn't. Sometimes you get it right. That's kind of less important. The important thing is being genuine and authentic in those moments. Yeah. Because once that moment's done and the emotion's gone, and I saw this through the redundancy processes, the number of conversations I had with people later down the years who had been through that were complimentary, and I was like, well, thanks, great, because you always wondered whether you did a good job or you didn't, and you still care about those individuals even after all those years, and so that kind of feedback is great to hear, even if it is a few years down the track. And there'll always be the ones that you could have done slightly better, where again they maybe become inflammatory and you have not reacted in the right way or the best way you can. So I always looked at those types of experiences as a positive now, but at the time it was hugely stressful, because the difficult thing is not carrying that transference onto you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly a man that sort of loves the challenge, because you managed to ride that one out, decided to leave in 2010, and most people flinch at the thought of trying to do any sort of business or work in Africa, and you decided that the next step would be to go and coach Kenya, a side that traditionally on the World Series has underperformed, and were there sort of for their funny, funky dances before tournaments, but weren't ever really considered to be a proper threat. What was the decision-making process between, you've been in the world of housing, you'd ridden it out, you'd come out in 2010 and then decided, I'm going to go to coach Kenya. Like, what was the that process?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's more of a twist and a turn in terms of how my kind of life has gone on my work side. Is that off the back of these kind of 9 and 10, what happened is that I kind of readdressed and re-looked at me and what I wanted to do, what I was enjoying, and I enjoyed running and building and trying to get this team back on track with DTZ. But with all of the things that happened in the city, I myself had dropped down from being full-time to being part-time.
Right.
Because we needed to maintain the business. And I said, well, look, I can go and do other things. You know, I've got other skill sets. And if you're going to give me the freedom, and DT said, well, we want your team leadership, your building of teams, your consistency, the processes you do around performance reviews and recruitment. We want that. I said, well, then I can do both, but let's give it a go and see. And at the same time, I was doing the media stuff with you, if you remember.
Yeah, it was Sky.
Sky. And there's a couple of individuals, let's just say, that were giving it to me off air or in the media, saying, well, what does he know? The game's changed. He's archaic. He hasn't got a Scooby-Doo. He's got all the opinions. Let's see if he can do it, you know? All talk, no action. Which, for someone like me, is probably the switch. And I actually took I went out to the Carlton Sevens, the Sri Lanka Sevens, which was their equivalent of the mini IPL cricket, and took an invitation team. Again, oh, let's just test this out. So I did that, you know, put my foot in the water. We won that series, had an amazing time, lit the Flyers, and before I know it, Kenya have phoned and said, would you consider coaching us? And, you know, you remember our chats in Sky. I was like, mate, this lot, they can play. They just need some direction, you know, athletic ability. So, you know, I've got in the back of my head those little voices of those individuals that are telling me that it's all changed. What do you know? I've got this curiosity. Can I? Has it? And I said, I'll come over and talk to you. So no word of a lie. I land over in Kenya. I'm talking to them. And I'm met by 4 TV crews whose first question is very pleased to hear you've taken the Kenya job. So that was welcome to African politics, welcome to the African way. So look, the long and the short of it is I ended up agreeing to do it. I obviously had to clear it through DTZ because it meant a slight change to my working schedule and how I worked. And they were supportive. And I took it on.
But how did, I mean, here it was, you've gone from RFU, loads of structure, loads of history, loads of talent, loads of, you know, frameworks, grassroots, etc., to DTZ again, big, you know, multinational, big corporate with process, bureaucracy, structure, to Kenya. I mean, literally the Wild West. I mean, you didn't even know you were the coach when you stepped off the plane, but apparently you were. You know, there was no grassroots. There was talent, but how you identify that and put it into a process. Like, how did you even tackle that scenario?
Well, this is like when, again, this is a frailty of my character, which was very clear to see. So I got there day one, and I sat there and I went to the high performance center, as they call it, which was a load of mud, and I was given a bag of balls and some cones, and then 30 blokes came running out, 10 minutes late, as always. And I did sit there and I was like, what have you done? Like, I genuinely had that, you know, that kind of fear in your stomach where it just drops and you're like, mate, you've just bitten way too much off. And I'm just sitting there, I'm like, oh my God. So I got through that session, and this is again how I think is that, right, I'm like, okay, now then I start pulling it apart and then build it back up on simplicity. And what Kenya made me do, I'll be eternally grateful for this, is they made me think about the game in its purest sense. So you just said that whether you're a corporate or whether you're a RFU, is what are the fundamentals? What do you need to be a successful team on and off the pitch. And I needed togetherness and camaraderie. I needed athletic ability, but I needed them to be fit, right? And I needed to understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and play to our strengths and minimise our exposure of our weaknesses. So that's how I approached that. I went back, I took it. Now, what I was fortunate about, and people don't realise, is that obviously Kenya's expat, it actually has a reasonable rugby structure. I mean, it's terribly political, but they've got 10, 11 clubs that provide a very strong rugby pathway.
Okay.
And then it was about giving them guidance, one, in understanding how to maximise their physical attributes, and athletically they're phenomenal, but they just needed guidance on how to get the best out of their body from S&C and supplements. You know, technically they just needed to improve their EQ. Well, that's the easy bit for me, and tactically we had to educate them as well. So those two parts were the hardest bits that were going to take a bit of time once we got them physically fit and able to do it. Mentally, you've never met a tougher group of men. You know, you don't know what hardship is unless you're in a third world country. Mm-hmm. So, you know, and these guys as well, they're what you would call the middle class within the third world country, you know, but nonetheless, there's proper hardship, and they understand the fundamentals of family or teamwork and what's expected and on what you need to do. So now it was about corralling them and giving them discipline to do it for one another every time, all the time, which comes back to consistency of communication and consistency of action, because what these boys were used to is being politically maneuvered and pawns in an African structure. So as they would describe me, they get a Toyo that comes in, and he gives them consistency in word and consistency in action, and he's prepared to stand there and fight for them for no material benefit to him. That was a really tough concept for them to get their heads around, because they were constantly looking for what's the catch.
How did you do that differently from in Kenya from in England? Because you said that you got some of those bits wrong in England from, you know, standing up for the player.
Yeah, well, because it's far more, the politics are far more crass and simplistic in Africa than they are in England. So, you know, the reality is that the most important thing is that if the players genuinely believe, and again, it comes back to that word trust, and I gained their trust by action because there was reservations to start with, that I would consistently do the right thing for the team. And again, if one of them was out of order, he was pulled into line, but those conversations they were had with everybody, so everybody had an opportunity to speak up and challenge and find out why and what. Because I operated in transparency with the squad. We had some disciplinary issues where players did things that shouldn't have been done, and they were high profile players or the stars. And again, some players didn't agree because they were disagreeing on friendship rather than rationale. Yeah. And likewise, dealing with the board is very much the same way, to the point where, again, if my values were compromised, I would piss or get off the pot. And everybody knew that.
And did you, as a process, did you start with a end goal and end vision, or you didn't know where that? Did you have one, or did you work back from it, or what was your method?
Yeah, well, our vision was to score 100 points in 10 tournaments. That was our vision, because
you got to 99, didn't you? Is that
in 9 tournaments? In 9 tournaments, I was robbed of a tournament. I was ahead of schedule. So. Yeah, it was. That was how we worked back, because I'm not a big believer in, you know, this, that. I work on the performance KPIs, and I work on the behaviours of what they need to be as men and as rugby players, and then that will drive the result. And that was how I articulated it to the Kenyan board. But it requires them to be a part of buying into the behaviours as well. Yeah. So if I'm going to hold the players to task, I have a responsibility and leadership to hold the people above me to task as well. And that, I think, is an important part of leadership. You know, if you're representing the people below to the people above, you have to hold them accountable as well. And good people at the top of a business want to be held accountable, want to be challenged. And if they don't, you've got to ask the reasons and the rationale why. So, you know, where we ended up with Kenya is there were a lot of times where that was the case, and the chairman was very much comfortable with that, as was the treasurer. But the African politics and the way that boards work is that they might be the two most powerful individuals, but they only got 2 votes. So there was all of this lobbying and internal stuff that gets bought and sold in the world of Kenya, which was beyond me. I mean, I sat in a boardroom once. This is a great story. Yeah. I sat in a boardroom once, and literally we went around the table, and I was talking to the performance director, who was, let's just say, he wasn't straight down the line, to the point where he literally admitted to the board that he had lied for the last 3 months. So in an English board, there's only one outcome.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting there going, well, he's just done that. They went, right, okay, then, brilliant, we'll move on. I was like, what do you mean we'll move on? We can't move on until he said, no, he's owned up. We don't cry over spilled milk, we move on.
How did you manage that?
Badly. I mean, those types of things that when I look back now, I laugh. At the time, it was one of those things I was like, you are kidding me. But you know, that was the nature of the beast that I had to operate in. And it was a constant.
So how did you navigate around that? Because obviously you've got an end goal, an end process. You're taking this side to different places it's never been before. Yeah. Like, how did you manage that? It sounds like most of the issues were off field. Yeah. So how did you navigate that? Because that's going to be challenges that people face all the time as well.
I had to maneuver and work with the people that were prepared to be worked with. But no, the harsh reality of that is that you can only do that for so long until something has to change. Because if the board is dysfunctional, then you're going to get very, very tired. And that is what happened, Ollie, if I'm honest with you. I mean, by the time we got to the end of the series, I was waking up to like 70 emails a day of one half of the board trying to upset the other half of the board, dysfunctional, and using the white kid in the middle. We got through that. I had sabotage, people trying to sabotage our World Cup camp and things like that. I finally got everybody out of Kenya, and we did it in England. And we went to the World Cup, and we lost narrowly in the semi-final to England in the rain. Yeah, in the rain, having been phenomenal. Never forgive the referee. But there we go. I'll let that go. And you know, best ever finish again for Kenya in a World Cup. We were recognised as where we were, but they still had this dysfunctional reality going on in the background, which I protected the players from for the whole season. But that, as a result, is again, it all landed on me, and there was nowhere else for me to go because there wasn't that infrastructure and support in place. So I was just getting.
Yeah. Would you have done anything different then? You just said you didn't have that support. Would you have fostered that?
Well, I fostered that with the individuals that I thought were the key stakeholders as best I could. But by the very same token, the way that the simplistic way it's set up in that particular instance, that board, it was very, very difficult. You know, I could have gone. I worked with there was another stakeholder called the patrons, but they were very hands off, and you had a lot of political manoeuvring there. And I think the lesson for me is that ultimately, you know, I'd done all I could do, and this is the only job I've ever walked away from, which I didn't really want to walk away from at that time. I was loving it, and I knew that we could kick on, but it was making me ill. So it comes back to that thing where I was tired. Like, I was really, really physically tired and mentally tired, and there was no end game because it was just too dysfunctional. And it was a real shame. And I had to, but I didn't shy away from the conversations. I sat with the senior boys who were all with me, and explained and went, and they understood. They were upset, as was I. I mean, you know, the big Kenyan boys. Yeah. I mean, we were in a room, we're all crying because but that's how it was. I just said, I can't carry on. And it was a hugely emotional time for me because I don't like walking away from things, especially that I'm committed to hugely, but this just was not healthy for me at that time, which was a shame. I haven't got the answers, if I'm honest with you, Ollie, about what I could have done differently on that one. I mean, because it was such an immature dynamic and crass and simplistic, without commercial reason,
it was about the purity. It was hard to navigate.
Yeah, I'd love another crack at trying to work that problem out at some time. It's.
Well, I mean, you said that it was unhealthy. It was doing you emotionally, physically exhausting, and then you decided to go and try and tame the biggest beast of all, accepted to become head coach for the USA. This massive sleeping giant that nobody had managed to awaken. What was the thought process in that?
Yeah, similar challenge, right? Okay, I think I've probably sat in the Sky Studios again because I was back now. Maybe with you.
Yeah, you were. Yeah,
eating chocolate again. But we were a team that massively underperforms. Now, what interested me about this team, which is different to the Kenyans, because the Kenyans was about their athletic ability and they weren't maximising that. When you look at the America, they athletically they looked great, but they just looked. They all looked individual and not on the same page, and I couldn't understand that. And again, it was Nigel Melville who phoned me and was asking me, what would I do? Would I consider? And I was like, you lot really interest me, because this is about your team dynamic. This is about how you operate, and that's what interested me about them. And like I said to you, a big driver for me as a person is to try and make you the best person you can be, the best player you can be. Because if I can make things better, that's what lights my fire. Yeah. And everything that comes to that's great.
Did you have a set, or do you have a set process or a set methodology that you've utilised from England, DTZ, Kenya, that you were like, here we go, I'll plug and play into USA?
I do, and you know it.
Yeah.
You do, and you know it. Yeah, I am. I mean, I live by pride. It's been with me since 2002, 2003, and it's pride in consistency of performance. And pride is an acronym, and all this is the plug in and play, but it's the start. It's not the end. It's always the start.
Yeah.
So,
do you want to tell everyone what pride stands for?
Yeah.
For you?
So pride is preparation, respect, intensity, desire, and execution. And then within that, there's generic holistic definitions of what that means. But then when I put it into the statement of pride in consistency of performance, it's very clear what I want. And that is about the end game, but also about the associated behaviours I expect and I want you to exhibit. But you've got the movement to move around and still be you. And, pride stayed as pride with England.
Yeah.
Pride grew into the Shuja pride. And that's what they became. And in America, pride has mutated into the dogs. And what that has become for them. But it's underpinned for me about giving consistency of message and action on the behaviours and the values that are expected if you want to be a part of this. And I will hold you to those standards, and you can hold me to those standards. And that doesn't absolve you from the freedom of being able to move around, because especially with men, they all like to test the boundaries, because that's what makes the spirit, and we don't want to kill the spirit. We need that in all of our teams. So,
wait, I was going to say, but you've gone to a USA team where, there is spirit and characters, and then there's, unbelievable spirit and characters, and some of the players that you've got there, some of the most talented, fastest, most athletic, the names roll off the tongue in Perry Baker, Carla Niles, Boom Boom Barrett, Anufe. Culturally, this is a very, very different challenge, and this is not the same as England. This is not even the same as Kenya. You've got diversity personified in this group. Yeah. How was that challenge, and how did you manage that, or how do you manage that? You're still there, so
this is the biggest challenge, right? And I didn't realise. It's a bit like I say this to everybody. You don't realise how big America is till you get there. You genuinely don't. And I didn't realise how diverse they were. I mean, you touched on it. The diversity is extreme, to the point where, and the way I describe this is, I've got one kid who's on food rations, and at the other end of the spectrum, I've got another kid that has a whinge if he only gets 2 desserts. And I put them on a rugby pitch. Normally, you can't tell the difference. You know the difference because their characters, their upbringings, the cultural differences are vast. So,
how do you switch off from that? How do you switch off from the? I imagine lots of people listening will resonate with and have empathy for the lad that's on food rations, and probably not have that much sympathy for the one that's on 2 desserts. But I presume this is about talent.
Well, it is about talent, but more importantly, it's about understanding each individual's drivers, and more importantly, not about me understanding each individual. It's getting them to understand each other's drivers, because the danger of a group that wide, and this is probably more akin to business, where you've got a lot more diverse personalities because they've got a lot more drivers while they're at work and in business. Yeah. Whereas in sport, the bandwidth is quite narrow. Is that understanding how he communicates, what drives him, is just as important, because you will make a decision on what he said on how you received it. And I know that's a very simplistic thing, but that's the reality. So my biggest challenge has been with these boys is, yes, I've got to make them physically better. Yes, I've got to make them technically better. Yes, I've got to make them tactically better. But more importantly, I've got to educate them to understand each other and understand the power of communication and the power of flexibility of communication, not only when you're talking, but also when you're listening. So you don't misread what somebody says. So just because Danny says it in a loud, aggressive voice doesn't mean he's angry with you. But if Maka Unefi hears it that way, then that will create a whole set of emotions and reactions that may make him shy in the corner and not do anything. And that wasn't what Danny was saying. But
how do you do that? How do you do that process?
But is that Danny's problem or is that Macca's problem? Actually, it's both of their problems. So my whole point was that for me, when I communicate with them, I've got to be so careful what I say and how I say it. And rather than one conversation, it's all the small conversations that I need to have in between. The other big part that we've had to work so hard on, and we continue to work on, is the education of our players on effective communication and understanding personalities. And in the modern world, it's even more important. So we do a lot of work away from the rugby pitch on effective communication and understanding personalities and saying information and receiving information, helping players to build confidence. Someone like Maka, who doesn't like to talk a lot, doesn't mean he's not engaged, because he's audio. He listens and he hears everything, but he just chooses not to talk. But there are times where he needs to come out of his comfort zone to give the assurances that Danny knows that Maka's on board. So that whole education process has been a huge part of trying to bring our team together. And it's not been an easy process, and it's a slow burn, because if you think about when I arrived, yes, we made an immediate improvement, but that was on pitch. But it's a lot easier moving from 13th to 5th, but a lot harder for moving from 5th to 4th and 4th to 3rd and 3rd to 2nd. So the culmination of what we've been doing the last 3 or 4 years on our effective communication and educating and getting the boys to see the value of that, not just in rugby, but in life in general, because they've got to have to do things after they finish playing in the population, in the workplace, around a lot of people that aren't like-minded. Yeah. Is so important. But it's getting them to understand the importance of that when they're like, I just want to play rugby, Mike.
And which one do you think has been the most important or the more valuable, the technical competency and tactical competency, or the emotional competency?
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, right, Ollie. I think it's more a case of you've got to layer it in at the right time. So I try to do all of this, And it's interesting, the bits that they picked up with the technical and tactical and physical, they didn't want anything to know about the emotional side.
Yeah.
And that was year one, because obviously I'd done that with England as well, to layer on with the younger boys. Less so in Kenya, because they're all the same, right? That's just how they are. And so we discarded it for 12 months. And then we came back to it once we had got these other bits. So what I'm saying is, what I think, again, this is a really valuable lesson I have learned as a leader, as a team builder, is I'm the type of guy that if I go out in the back garden and build a tent, I've got to come in with the tent done and 4 legs down. And what I got taught was, don't worry about the 4 legs, Mike. You can come in and put the 4th leg in later, because it will still stand as a 3-legged tent. Yeah. Now that's really, really hard to get your head around when you're not built that way, but you've got to be prepared. You can't do it all at once. You've got to be prepared to leave some things undone, knowing that you can come back tomorrow to fix it. Because the key thing for me is I like to fix things.
How do you know which are the most important legs that need to be left in?
Well, here's the thing. Well, this is my point. Actually, I think your players will help you. You know, because for them, the most important things at that time were the physical, the technical and tactical. Irrelevant whether I thought the mental was. The fact of the matter is that they weren't interested in putting that leg down. So if your group, you're not listening to your group and they're not interested in that, doesn't mean that it's not important. It just means it's not important at that moment. You haven't done a good enough sales pitch for them to see that importance. And that's the way that we've gone about this. I was always coming back to it. It was just I had to chip away a little bit more, and I had to be a little bit relentless. And I think, you know, as I've got older, I've realised and recognised that you haven't got to win every battle. I've just got to win that war, which means now they fully embrace it. Now I'm moving on to the next things around their mental well-being and the art of exploring things like, you know, the power of breathing and alpha sequences and getting ourselves in states. You know, some of them are looking at me like, here we go again. And it's like, I see that, but nonetheless, we'll chip away. We'll get there, because you'll see the power of it. You've got to help them to get to the answer.
But then I guess that then comes down to how power. I don't know if you do this. It's probably the question actually is, you know, are you doing goal and vision alignment of that, as in, you know, if they want to do breathing exercises and power the alpha or whatever else, is that aligned to something? Like, and what is that something?
It is. I mean, ultimately we're aligned to our vision. Okay, and our vision is a mixture of, in the American landscape, we're medal orientated.
Yeah.
But we're not just medal orientated. We're also about being pioneers and making sure that we leave the game in a better place and inspire the next group. Because if we want rugby to be successful in America, it has to complement the super sport landscape. And that means we've got to create positive role models attached to winning, because the American sporting landscape, especially when they deal with the national team, that's great, but we have to be winners.
Yeah.
Being participants isn't enough for them. So it is aligned to that. But for me, it's more about for each of my players, there's a toolbox. And I'm going to give you as many of the tools that I think you require. And you can come to me and say, I want to put this tool in too. Because I've got to try and make you the best version of you. And I say that, I talk about developing the man. Because if I develop the man holistically on and off the pitch, I get a better rugby player. And I know that's more akin to sport than business. But is it really? I don't know. Because if I develop the man from his behaviours, his character, as well as his technical and tactical ability, and I guide him, I mentor him, sometimes the hard word, sometimes the soft word, then actually I give him the best chance to succeed.
And when do you know where a time is come where you have to just cut the cord?
Well, yeah, I mean that comes to the point where you change the man or you change the man, right? And we've done that, because if you don't adhere to the behaviours and the values of the squad and the environment, and you continually step over the line, then you don't want to be here. And why that's not me being harsh, Ollie, because the reality is the values and the behaviours are just about being a good person.
Yeah.
So it's not. I'm not asking for them to be in at 4 a.m. Do you know what I mean? There's nothing. untowards about what's been asked of them as a person. So, you know, there does come a point if they're not putting the team first, or they can't articulate or explain why they've done what they've done, then you say, well, maybe this isn't the place for you.
Yeah.
And that's fine, because that might be the case. It not whether you're in business and sport, the same place isn't the same place for everybody. Otherwise, the world would be very boring. So it's understanding: is this the best fit for me? And do I fit in? And can I add value and maximize this? And will this place make me happy and allow me to fulfill my ambitions? And that's kind of, you know, the way that we look at things.
I mean, one of the questions I've got is around dealing with pressure and then dealing with disappointment. So obviously you mentioned the way that the US psyche is orchestrated towards winners, gold medals, etc., etc. And you know, last season, it was a pivotal year for US rugby. You guys were inches away from being number one side in the world, and just lost out on the World Series in the last tournament. And you had a World Cup in the US, you know, where I imagine all expectations and eyes were on. You know, this is the first time that the US has staged a major flagship rugby tournament. All eyes are on the US, an expectation for them to win it in their backyard. And unfortunately, neither of those, you know, delivered. Everyone would say, if you looked at it on a front end, you've over-delivered. But actually, in terms of expectations, was that twofold questions? One, how did you handle the pressure of being potentially number one side in the world and having a World Cup in your own back garden? And then second part of that question, how did you then, was it viewed as a disappointment, and how did you manage that disappointment?
I think the World Cup one, that hit us hard. You know, the whole kind of format and the way that World Cup was, and the nature in which we went out of the World Cup in extra time with just the most unbelievable clutch play by Mitchell and Burgess for England, was, I mean, that hit us so hard, because, you know, again, they were but ifs, because we could have won that game. It was a real tight thing, and then to go out the way we did, the disappointment was huge, because we felt that we were capable of winning that World Cup, and there wasn't the pressure on playing, because we actually played well. How
did you get your team? How did you get your team to manage that? How did you, collectively and personally, and then re-engage with the vision, if you like, because this was a huge flag in the sand that you needed to get to.
Yeah. I mean, I think going into the tournament, we managed the pressure well. Our build-up was great. We were comfortable. So, you know, the outcome didn't happen, and that's sport. The disappointment from that was massive in the way that we were, and we didn't hide that disappointment, and I encouraged that disappointment to be there. But by the same token, that actually fueled us coming into that next season. So we turned that disappointment into a positive mindset to fuel us for the start of the season.
And how did you do that?
A mixture of, like, do you want to, you know, again, it's a mixture of an away and towards, right? The away was, do you ever want to feel like that again? You know, let's kind of right the wrong. Let's get after the World Series. Let's get our Olympic qualification. Let's take what's ours. So, you know, that kind of Colosseum gladiator stuff. And then with that alongside is, well, what do we need to do better? What do we need to be better at? What do we need to change? That kind of analytical part was going off the pitch, and are we going to commit to it? And we entered that next season in a decent place, and we'd aligned ourselves on from an analysis perspective, what we needed to change and alter, what would be the little bits and pieces that would make a difference to us. We were working hard on developing the next group, because you're only as good as what's coming next. And one of the criticisms that's still with us is that player depth isn't what it needs to be. So we're not reliant on one person if they choose to not live the way that we want to live, or we lose someone to injury, and both can happen, especially in a long season. So we aren't quite there in terms of that balance. Do you know what I mean? So we're still walking the line on that. So, you know, getting the right balance in your team is everything, and in your squad is everything. So, you know, I felt we were in decent shape, and then you are at the laps of the gods of going into the World Series and trying to minimise any sort of things that can influence a negative result. And we did a proper job in the season. I think the reality is, again, when we look back at the disappointment of that whole season of just finishing second, everybody would talk about that game in Paris where it was nip and tuck and we forced it and we threw the offload and that ended up them scoring and they go down the end and they ended up winning by 12 points. Series gone. That isn't, when we looked at that, and I said to the boys, you can be very proud about what you've done, but we're going to look at this in the cold light of the day. That isn't where the series was lost. The series was lost in Hong Kong when we were in a semi-final against Hong Kong and against Fiji, and we had 6 opportunities to score, and we didn't take those opportunities for one reason or another, and that is the game that Fiji won. Ended up winning the Hong Kong Sevens for the 5th time in a row and broke another record, which upset me. And they then got their confidence to kick on, and they ended up performing to their ability rather than us killing them off there. And when we stripped it right back, we looked at that, came down to all things that were in our control within the game, and our areas where as individuals, do we take enough responsibility to ensure that we're doing all we can to make sure we minimise those errors? And that's not just whether you're an experienced player that's got 70 caps. It's whether you're an inexperienced player who's in for your 8th cap, but we've had an injury and you've got to go in minute 1. And that's what happened. So the Sevens environment is very unforgiving on experience. Once you're in it, it's sink or swim.
Yeah.
And you can't, we as coaches have got to do a much better job at preparing those players when they get put in, that they can swim, not sink. And that's hard, you know, that's hard for the player, that's hard for the coaches, but that's the challenge. And that's our learning from that season, which again, going into this season that we've just been, where we had even more or less experienced players, we have tried hard to ensure that we get better at that and they get better at that. We haven't got it right the whole time, but it's about building it towards the end vision which is, can we do that in Tokyo now in 2021?
And how have you managed? It sounds like you've managed that process well from a on-field, call it internal stakeholder perspective. How have you managed that from an off-field external stakeholder perspective? You've got a US public, a US board that would have seen you second in the world, you know, nearly winning the whole thing, ranked number 1 for a large part of the season. Now, were their expectations now, like, you guys are, you know, the best in the world, number 1 in the world, you should be up here all the time? How did you manage that process, or managing that process?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that's my job, and I do play that down, and I make it very clear what the realities are. I don't devalue what the players have done. I don't devalue what the squad has done. I don't devalue the fact that this is where we aspire to be all the time. But I also make it very clear in the messaging in terms of what our challenges are, and what we need the solutions to be to allow us to progress and be everything that you want us to be all the time, every time. So our messaging on that front is precise and very focused to ensure that we manage expectations. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I think the realities are the realities, and especially in the landscape we're in. But this is where we want to be, and this is what we're capable of being. But these are the holes that we need to find solutions for. Okay. So that's how we address that messaging.
And so you're making sure that they're aware of issues, so you're bringing them along with you along the way to try and help solve those problems.
I want them. Yeah, I need them to be part of the solution. You know, we're like you said, the internal stakeholders are stakeholders. The external stakeholders are still stakeholders. She's still part of our team. So, you know, likewise, we're very fortunate to have this external philanthropy group called the Golden Eagles, who are a huge part of our solution. And these are successful businessmen that have a huge passion for rugby and USA. And we make them very much part of our team because they want to help the boys, and they can also mentor and guide the boys after rugby as well. So you know, those types of stakeholders are just as important as the USOPC and you know what we receive from World Rugby as well.
Okay. And just to bring back on another point you were talking around the World Cup, because I just was intrigued around it. You said that, you know, we managed that pressure building in and that expectation from internal and external. Like, was there anything you did to manage that? I mean, because people, I imagine listening, will be wondering, you know, I get pressure all the time and expectation placed on me that sometimes is unreasonable. Like, how do you manage that? Is there a method, or what do you do?
No, I mean, again, for me, externally, if I deal with the media and the press, then I will speak frankly, and I will distract the pressure away from the players, and I will give the people the clear message of what the realities are, if that's what I want to achieve. Mm-hmm. Internally, I will share with them the strategy of what I've done externally, but what my expectations are internally.
Yeah.
And I allow them to focus on not the emotion of the result. Let's focus on the process of what we need to do to ensure that our performance standards are where they are. Because if we do that, then we stand a far better chance of winning than losing. And the reality is, in the game of sevens, there's always a chance that you could all hit your KPIs, but one bounce of the ball means you lose by a point. Mm-hmm. And you don't have enough time to recover. It's very different to the 15s game, where it ain't about the last 2 minutes, because there's been 78 minutes before. Yeah. So, you know, again, it's that coordination and that communication to the internal crew, so they understand and appreciate what's been done externally, so that they don't misread what we might do externally.
And how do you manage the pressure personally?
I don't know. I enjoy that. So I enjoy that type of pressure, and I enjoy that sort of challenge, because that's what drives me. And internally, I love protecting and making them the best version they are. Yeah. Probably where I get it wrong, or I can allow things to boil over, is with them, because I want it so much for them. I sometimes can push them too hard, and you know, I have. At times, I have a great conversation with Perry. There's at times where you'll have experienced this with me, where I've literally just lost it with them, and I didn't consciously make that decision to lose it with them, and that's my mistake then. And then I'll apologise to him, and then Perry will go, "Why you just apologise?" I said, "Because that wasn't my choice to lose it with you. I allowed my emotions to get the better of me."
Yeah.
There's times where I will proactively do that to get a reaction from you, but it has to be on my terms. And I said that's a skill set you boys need to be better at. Yeah. On a rugby pitch. So that's probably where I can still be better. This bit, I see it for what it is, and my pressure that I put on myself is about delivering for the players.
A couple more broader questions, and then I've sadly got to let you go, even though I don't want to. But how do you differentiate between a coach and a manager? Are they different things?
I don't know what when you say what, a manager in business or a manager in sport?
Either. And okay. Is there a difference between being a coach and being a manager? So
I'll answer that question on a title basis, because I was a manager of people in business, and I'm a coach. For me, it's the same thing. It's about providing the forum and the environment to allow the people that you manage or you coach the best version of themselves. You have a responsibility to develop the man or the woman, And the way I approach that as a coach in sport or as a manager in business is, it's not about them, the player or the employee, molding themselves around me and what I want. Is about me as that coach molding myself around them to allow them to be the best version of themselves, both on an individual perspective and an expectation as how they fit in and are part of the team.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. And then I guess just a couple of things listening, because it's been absolutely fascinating. But like, what any particular areas where you've learned the most or learned the least, or little moments where you're like, God, I wish I'd done that differently. So are there things that stick with you in time of, damn it, I wish I had. That was a brilliant moment, great decision, and I wish I'd done that one slightly differently. Apart from picking Ollie Phillips, that one can be removed.
Yeah. I think, like I said, we talk about regrets. My biggest regret is I wish I had just walked away gracefully in 2006 from England and not got caught up in some personal little battles that were personality driven.
Does that stood you now and test of time? When you're walking away from scenarios, make sure you.
Yeah, it has. Away. I'm far. Without a shadow, I learned. It took me 5 or 6 years to realise that. But I certainly, I learned, and I apologise 5 or 6 years later. But nonetheless, doesn't make it right. Is that I needed to realise you don't need to win every battle. Yeah. It's about how that you walk away and you've been authentic and being yourself.
The best learning.
My best learning. I mean, honestly, the best learning, the best stuff is all around flexibility and communication and working on personalities and understanding personalities and people. I think in the modern world we live in, if you want to be an effective leader, manager, coach, mentor, if you don't understand people and you don't look and work to improve yourself, so you consciously understand that, then you will not survive.
How do you maintain how do you maintain that level of consciousness to be broad? Because obviously we're creatures of habit. You like things done your way. Blah blah blah. How do you keep that level of open-mindedness?
Well, I think you have to explore. You have to be curious, and I think that's harder for an older person than a younger person. But I think what the way that I was brought up or the way that you was brought up is very different to the way that the next generation have been brought up. So you have to move with the times. You have to seek new learning, new understanding. You've got to seek to understand your people, and you've got to help them to understand you. And I think, like when we talk about effective communication, it is two-way. And that, I think, any sort of learnings, and some of it you can still choose to take some of it on board and discard others. But by the same token, if you haven't been curious to find out about it or investigate it or consider it, then you're closing your mind off to possibilities.
That's a great tip.
Being authentic and being effective and flexible in that communication whilst remaining authentic is crucial to being effective and being part of a team.
A few golden tips there, but I was just wondering if I guess in closing on this, if anyone's ever inspired you or given you a tip or a little gem of advice that stuck with you all the way through, that maybe you may well have already said it in terms of being authentic or whatever, but is there anyone in particular that if you were to leave everyone here today with like a particular gem or thought process, what would it be?
One of the guys that, and I didn't spend a lot of time with him, right? But the time I spent with him was great, and I spent time with him as a player, and then I also spent time with him coach to coach. Is Gatland. The way that Gatland understands his players, he watches, he motivates, he pushes and he pulls and he individualizes his communication, but also his actions, but without showing favoritism. Has stood the test of time with me. He's a master of that. and you've seen it in the way that he delivers his external messaging in the media and how he deals with things internally as well, you know. And the other thing about Gats, which always interests me, is, and I'm not like him in this way, is that sometimes you're left wondering what he thinks, but you never doubt and you never not trust him in what he does think, even if you don't know, which is maybe to keep players on their toes, I don't know. But whereas I'm more about my expectations are there, and I'm always prepared to have the conversation, the hard or and give you the answers you might not like to hear. So that's a difference in style. But you know, I think the way he operates in with the Lions, with Wales, and now you've seen when he's gone to Waikato, there was an immediate upside. And obviously, when I was at Wasps, how he transformed Wasps. Same players, same talent, all about how he dealt with the group. Yeah.
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure as always, mate. Thanks ever so much for coming on the Grow Show. It's been brilliant to have you here. Thanks ever so much, buddy.
No, mate, thanks for having me. It's been great fun. Good stuff.